My father, Richard Williams, held the champagne flute with the casual confidence of a man who measured his worth in 7 figures, his tailored suit perfectly concealing the tension that always simmered beneath his polished exterior. He stood on the terrace of the Rosewood Resort, the setting sun catching the diamond on Eleanor's finger, surrounded by a constellation of New York's elite, investment bankers, socialites, and corporate lawyers. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, self-satisfied hum of success. This was his world, and I was merely a satellite dragged into his orbit for the weekend. He spotted me lingering near a palm tree, trying to become invisible, and beckoned me over with a slight, almost imperceptible flick of his wrist. I knew what was coming. It always came. "Samantha, darling," he purred, his smile stretching tight as he introduced me to Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, the CEO of a rival firm. "I want you to meet my daughter." He paused, letting the silence draw out just long enough to emphasize the impending punchline. The Petersons, draped in enough gold and silk to fund a small nation, offered polite, expectant smiles. Richard then dropped the line, that carefully chosen phrase that acted like a cold slap in the face, "She's a security guard." He didn't say threat assessment specialist. He didn't say senior operative at Meridian Protection Services. He didn't even mention my military background or my degree in criminal justice. Just, security guard. The word hung in the air, weighted with his disappointment, the subtle downturn of his lips conveying more scorn than any shouted insult ever could. He followed it up with a theatrical shrug, a gesture that clearly communicated, "She chose this strange, unfortunate path, what can you do?" Mrs. Peterson's smile faltered, replaced by a patronizing pity. Mr. Peterson nodded stiffly, instantly dismissing me as irrelevant, turning his attention back to Richard to discuss the merger they had been analyzing before the interruption. I felt the familiar, hot wave of humiliation and resentment wash over me, but years of military training allowed me to plaster a neutral expression onto my face. I offered a firm handshake, ensuring my gaze met theirs directly, refusing to shrink under their judgment, and muttered, "A pleasure," before retreating back toward the shadows, the sting of my father's introduction already merging into the ambient background noise of the lavish celebration. It was a familiar ritual, one that had played out countless times over the years, solidifying the chasm between us. He had built this entire weekend, this entire life, on appearance and prestige, and my career was the one imperfection he couldn't smooth over. If only he knew, if only any of these self-assured, diamond-clad guests knew, that in less than an hour, that very profession he so casually dismissed, that ability to see the danger hidden beneath the polished surface, would be the only thing standing between them and utter catastrophe. This weekend wasn't just about celebrating Richard and Eleanor's union, it was set to become a grim, high-stakes test of survival, dictated by skills he never wanted me to possess. The irony was suffocating, and I knew, deep down, that his sour look of disappointment would be replaced by something far more profound before the night was through. This was not the reunion I had hoped for, but it would certainly be the confrontation we both needed, though neither of us expected it to be played out under the threat of armed robbery and violence. The root of our fractured relationship stretched back nearly 2 decades, solidified by Richard's rigid, unwavering definition of success. He was a man obsessed with pedigree and trajectory. For him, life was a carefully plotted graph ascending toward power and wealth. Anything that deviated from that trajectory was a failure, a personal slight. Our suburban home, where I spent my childhood before the divorce, wasn't just a house, it was a statement. The perfection of the gardens, the imported marble countertops, the annual, perfectly orchestrated family Christmas card, it was all stagecraft designed to reinforce his status as a senior investment banker at Rothschild & Company. When my mother, Audrey, finally decided she couldn't breathe in his meticulously curated world, I was 12. Mom, a kindergarten teacher whose compassion eclipsed his ambition, valued authenticity and kindness over quarterly earnings reports. The divorce was messy, but the custody arrangement was clear: weekdays with Mom in her cozy, slightly bohemian apartment, weekends with Dad in his sterile, glass and steel penthouse overlooking Central Park. Those weekends became pressure cookers of expectation. Every dinner conversation was a performance review of my academic progress and my future planning. My path was laid out: Ivy League acceptance, followed by a coveted position in corporate law or finance, leveraging his network. When I turned 18, the pressure reached its zenith. I had spent 4 intense years in JROTC, discovered a fierce love for discipline, structure, and the palpable satisfaction of true operational effectiveness. I announced, quietly, one Sunday morning over a brunch Richard had catered, that I was enlisting in the army. The ensuing silence was deafening, broken only by the clinking of silver against porcelain. Richard's face went white with fury. "The military?" he finally spat out, as if the word itself was contaminated. "Samantha, people from our background do not enlist. That is not the path we take. You apply to Yale, you don't sign up to scrub toilets for the government. If you must serve, you become an officer, not enlisted personnel." His rejection was absolute, dismissive of the deep, personal calling I felt toward service. I enlisted anyway, a silent act of rebellion that irrevocably set my course. For years in the Army Special Forces support divisions provided more education than any university could have, teaching me how to lead under extreme duress, how to assess and neutralize threats, and how to value skill over titles. After my honorable discharge, I leveraged my GI Bill, earning my degree in criminal justice while simultaneously gaining real-world experience as a campus security officer. This led, eventually, to Meridian Protection Services, where I quickly rose through the ranks. Meridian wasn't some fly-by-night operation, we were highly sought after for complex executive protection, diplomatic event security, and advanced threat modeling. I had recently been the lead operative securing a major UN summit, an accomplishment that earned my firm massive respect and me a coveted Professional Achievement Award nomination. But to Richard, it was all irrelevant. The uniform, the tactical training, the late nights studying predictive risk models, it all amounted to failure because I hadn't chosen the prestige he demanded. He saw the security guard uniform, not the capabilities beneath it, a perception I knew stemmed from his inability to acknowledge any success that wasn't stamped with his approval. That knowledge was the heavy baggage I carried into the Rosewood Resort that weekend, weighing down my resolve even as my professional confidence remained unshaken. His impending wedding wasn't a family affair, it was another stage for him to parade his achievements and highlight my shortcomings, one meticulously planned introduction at a time. The Rosewood Resort was an architectural ode to excess, a sprawling complex that merged Mediterranean opulence with New York corporate money. Every surface gleamed, every staff member moved with precise, choreographed grace, creating an atmosphere that felt less like a celebration and more like a carefully managed investment portfolio. I checked in late Friday afternoon, feeling instantly out of sync with the pastel linens and the soft, condescending murmurs of the early arriving guests. The rehearsal dinner that evening was held in a private glass pavilion overlooking the Pacific, the sunset painting the sky in fiery hues that ironically mirrored my inner turmoil. My assigned table was tucked into the corner, far from the central action where Richard and Eleanor presided like royalty. It was a clear designation of my status, tolerated but peripheral. The introduction started almost immediately, a systematic dismantling of my professional identity. Richard made a point of circling the room, bringing over select guests, predominantly those whose opinions he valued most. "This is my daughter, Samantha," he began, always using the exact same cadence, "she's a security guard." He spoke it as if clarifying that I was simply holding a place card or arranging flowers, nothing more. There was Mr. Thompson, the renowned hedge fund manager, who squinted at me and asked, "Oh, like retail security? Loss prevention?" Richard merely chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound, allowing the assumption to stand, unwilling to elaborate on the nuanced reality of my high-risk, high-reward profession. Then came Mrs. Albright, a prominent charity chairwoman, who offered me a sickly sweet smile and said, "Well, someone has to do those jobs, dear. It's certainly honest work." Her implication was clear, it was a consolation prize for someone who couldn't cut it in the real world. I resisted the urge to launch into a detailed explanation of the global threat assessment protocols I managed, the multi-million-dollar contracts Meridian handled, or the international recognition I had earned. What was the point? Richard didn't want his guests to understand, he wanted them to pity him for having such an unconventional, unprestigious offspring. This cycle repeated itself nearly a dozen times before the main course arrived. Each interaction peeled back another layer of my patience, replacing it with a hard shell of resignation. I was reduced to a caricature, stripped of my accomplishments, my identity flattened into a single, embarrassing job title. I attempted to engage one of his peers, Mr. Davies, about the rising geopolitical risks affecting his market, referencing a recent briefing I had prepared. Mr. Davies listened for a moment, then abruptly interrupted me, turning back to Richard. Say, Richard, how is that merger progressing? Heard the Q3 projections are looking stellar. The message was unequivocal. My professional input, born of highly specialized knowledge, was worthless in their world. I retreated further into myself, realizing that Alicia, my friend who had urged me to attend, had been wrong. This time wasn't different, it was just a more expensive, more painful repetition of the same old dynamic. By the time I finished my dessert, the exquisite, multi-layered chocolate mousse tasting like ash in my mouth, I was ready to leave. I reminded myself of my mother's quiet wisdom: his inability to appreciate your choices is his failure, not yours. But knowing that intellectually did little to soothe the profound sense of isolation I felt among hundreds of people who saw me as nothing more than Richard Williams' unfortunate mistake. I determined then and there that I would minimize my presence on the actual wedding day, perhaps attend the ceremony briefly, and then make a quiet exit before the reception, avoiding any further ritualistic humiliation. The wedding day dawned with a brilliance that seemed aggressively joyful, a stark contrast to my mood. The air was crisp, the ocean impossibly blue, and the sprawling gardens of the Rosewood were already a flurry of activity, florists adding final touches to elaborate archways, photographers setting up carefully composed shots, and catering staff moving with quiet efficiency. I tried to maintain a low profile, spending the early hours reading near the pool, safely distanced from the bridal suite hysteria. But the professional part of my brain, the part that had been honed through years of vigilance and operational readiness, refused to relax. Working in high-stakes security doesn't just train you to react to danger, it trains you to anticipate it, to see the threadbare stitching in the perfect tapestry of an event. It's about spotting the anomaly, the element that doesn't belong. It was during the pre-ceremony bustle, as I edged closer to the main gathering area, trying to find an inconspicuous seat in the back rows, that the first anomaly registered. My attention was drawn to a member of the catering staff positioning a large ice sculpture near the champagne fountain. Everything about him was slightly off. His uniform, a standard white shirt and black waistcoat, was ill-fitting, too tight across the shoulders and poorly laundered, suggesting it wasn't his regular uniform or that he wasn't accustomed to wearing service attire. More tellingly, his movements lacked the rhythmic flow of professional service personnel. He wasn't focused on his task, nor was he discreetly observing guests' needs. Instead, his gaze was sweeping the room in a sharp, almost military pattern. It was a methodical surveillance sweep, designed to map exits, identify points of weakness, and catalog high-value targets. I recognized the pattern immediately. It was the assessment scan taught in basic reconnaissance training, not the look of someone concerned with canapés. I dismissed it initially as occupational paranoia, a hazard of my trade. But the feeling, that cold prickle on the back of my neck that always signaled genuine threat, persisted. Moments later, I watched the same man briefly intersect with two other individuals similarly dressed in catering uniforms. Their interaction was too quick, their body language too stiff and purposeful for casual staff chatter. They exchanged rapid, nonverbal signals, a subtle nod, a fleeting hand gesture, and then resumed their positions, one near the main entrance, the other taking a position by the temporary bar. Both displayed the same unnatural alertness, the same calculated scanning pattern. A true professional in event catering blends into the environment, becoming part of the invisible machinery of service. These three men stood out, rigid figures against the soft backdrop of celebration. My internal threat assessment matrix began compiling data: 3 individuals, coordinating, exhibiting surveillance behavior, positioned strategically near potential ingress/egress points and high-traffic areas. The nagging feeling crystallized into a cold, hard certainty: this wasn't a professional hazard, this was an active, developing threat. My immediate, trained instinct was to intervene, but without concrete evidence, any action would simply cause a massive disruption and potentially lead to professional blowback, reinforcing my father's belief that my career was all drama and zero prestige. Yet, the possibility of risk was too high to ignore, especially at an event filled with high-net-worth individuals, targets precisely of the type I was trained to protect. I decided I needed confirmation, something more tangible than a bad feeling and poorly fitted shirts, before I escalated the situation. The responsibility suddenly felt immense, a weight I alone carried amidst the oblivious gaiety. The decision to verify my suspicions overruled every desire I had to remain invisible. The security expert in me took command, overriding the disappointed daughter. I needed to know what they were planning, and when. I discreetly began tracking one of the men, the one near the bar, using the dense floral arrangements and strolling guests as cover. He moved quickly and efficiently, slipping away from the main gathering and into a service corridor that led behind the reception kitchen and towards the resort's loading docks. This was a critical operational failure on the resort's part. Service corridors should never offer such discreet access routes to high-traffic guest areas. I maintained a cautious distance, noting the man paused only to check his reflection in a fire extinguisher cabinet, not out of vanity, but to ensure no one was trailing him. He ducked into a small, unmarked storage room at the far end of the corridor, pulling the door almost shut behind him. I moved fast, flattening myself against the cool stucco wall just feet from the door, concealed by a towering stack of freshly laundered table linens on a rolling cart. The storage room was poorly insulated, and the walls were thin. I could hear muffled voices inside. The silence of the corridor amplified the fragments of conversation that slipped through the crack of the door. The first voice was rough, American, likely the man I had followed. He was speaking into what sounded like a discreet comms unit or a satellite phone, judging by the slight static. Affirmative, 3 are positioned. Clean sight lines on the principal targets. A second, deeper voice, likely the one near the entrance, chimed in, rich pickings. I estimate $2 million in jewelry alone on the old crow and the bride's mother. The collection point is still the East End utility closet. My blood ran instantly cold. This wasn't petty theft, this was a coordinated, high-value armed robbery targeting the guests. The first voice continued, detailing the timeline. After the vows, during the champagne toast, that's the window. We need the disruption sequence ready at 16:30 sharp. The second voice added, for more coming through the east entrance right at 16:25, disguised as late floral deliveries. That brings us to 7 total. No resistance, quick smash and grab. Get in, get the assets, get out. 7 armed men. High probability of violence. The confirmation was terrifyingly concrete. I waited until the door opened and the man slipped back out, moving quickly toward the main reception area. Before I retreated in the opposite direction, my mind already racing through operational protocols. My immediate priority was neutralization and evacuation, but the lack of centralized command was a severe disadvantage. I found a secluded utility alcove near the resort offices and pulled out my phone. Protocol dictated I contact local law enforcement first. I identified myself as a professional security consultant, detailed the specific threat, 7 perpetrators, high-value robbery, planned entry point and time and location. The dispatcher was professional but slow, requiring several minutes of precise detail. She finally confirmed, officers are being dispatched, ma'am, estimated ETA is 20 minutes due to current call volume. 20 minutes. The robbery was slated to start in about 15. They would be too late. Next, I located the resort's private security office. Showing my Meridian, Idaho gave me immediate, though wary, access to the head of resort security, Michael Jenkins, a tired-looking man in his late 50s. I laid out the threat assessment clearly, concisely, without exaggeration. Mr. Jenkins, we have 7 confirmed armed perpetrators planning a coordinated strike at 16:30. Entry point East Delivery Dock, current team positioning 3 suspects within the reception area, possibly armed already. Jenkins looked skeptical. You want me to disrupt a multi-million-dollar wedding based on an overheard conversation? I want you to save lives, I countered sharply, my professional authority cutting through his complacency. The police are en route, but they won't arrive for at least 15 minutes. You need to position your personnel at all exits, secure the delivery docks, and be prepared for armed conflict. I pulled up a quick schematic of the grounds on his desk computer, marking the suspicious positions and the entry point, the clarity and precision of my analysis finally winning him over. The threat suggested 7 total, I reminded him, with 4 yet to arrive via the east entrance. Focus your team there and block all vehicular access now. Jenkins, finally recognizing he was dealing with a professional and not a panicked guest, grabbed his radio. All right, Williams. Let's move. I knew that even with Jenkins' limited team mobilized, we were severely outgunned and outmatched, but it was the only buffer we had until the police arrived. As I stood there, preparing to re-enter the ceremony area to monitor the suspects, I felt the immense weight of the situation. My father, Richard, was completely oblivious, moments away from saying I do, utterly dependent on the competence of the daughter he spent his life dismissing. Asterisk, have you ever been in a situation where your greatest strength was something someone you deeply respected refused to acknowledge? Did that lack of recognition make it harder or easier to step up when crisis hit? Please share your experience in the comments below. Asterisk. With the skeletal defensive strategy in place, Jenkins mobilizing his 6 security guards and me providing forward threat monitoring, I raced back toward the gathering. The ceremony was already in full swing. Richard stood at the altar, impeccably dressed, a broad, genuine smile fixed on his face as he watched Eleanor, radiant in lace, take the final steps toward him on her father's arm. The setting was idyllic, framed by towering rose bushes and the distant, shimmering ocean. For a fleeting second, watching him stand there, bathed in happiness and blinding white light, I felt a familiar pang of longing, a wish that our relationship could ever be as pure and uncomplicated as this moment appeared. But that emotional diversion lasted only a heartbeat. My vigilance was immediately pulled back to the perimeter. My eyes swept the crowd, not for emotional cues, but for tactical signatures. I confirmed the locations of the 3 internal suspects. The man near the bar was now casually wiping down surfaces, positioned perfectly to observe the guests and, more importantly, to access the high-value area near the bridal party. The second man, near the main garden entrance, was subtly checking his wristwatch, coordinating the final countdown. The third was mingling near the orchestra, a hand constantly brushing against his side, possibly adjusting a concealed weapon. I chose a spot slightly off-center, positioned behind a massive floral arrangement that offered both concealment and a panoramic view of the action, close enough to intervene, but not so close as to alert the suspects. The vows were exchanged. The standard, emotional promises flowed, the words blurring into background noise as I focused intently on the clock, counting down the minutes until 16:25, the scheduled arrival of the 4 reinforcements. Jenkins had confirmed via a hushed radio communication that his team was now positioned near the east entrance, discreetly monitoring the loading dock, but he cautioned that they were only lightly armed with pepper spray and batons, absolutely no match for 7 armed robbers. The tension became physically palpable, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The moment the officiant declared Richard and Eleanor husband and wife, a roar of applause erupted. The transition to the reception was instantaneous. Servers, including the 3 suspects, materialized with trays of sparkling champagne. The guests, giddy with celebration, began to cluster, reaching for flutes and exchanging hearty congratulations. This was the exact vulnerability window the robbers had identified, the moment of maximum distraction, when high-value assets, jewelry, watches, were on display, and attention was diffused. My internal clock hit 16:25. I strained my eyes toward the east service area, expecting the arrival of the floral delivery van. But Jenkins' voice crackled over the security radio, negative on the external suspects, Williams. Nothing moving at the dock. A sudden, chilling realization washed over me. The east entrance wasn't the external loading dock, it was likely an interior service entrance, a subtle psychological misdirect designed to preoccupy resort security outside while the true threat escalated inside. The robbers weren't waiting for external help, they were already positioning themselves, ready to move. The situation was deteriorating faster than I had calculated. I scanned the area near the indoor-outdoor transition points and saw the 3 initial suspects now coordinating via discreet earpieces, their casual movements replaced by a sudden, intense focus. The police still hadn't arrived. I was alone, seconds away from a kinetic event, facing 7 potential threats I had previously underestimated. I had to create a distraction, a diversion, or find a way to warn my father without causing an open panic that might provoke the armed men into indiscriminate violence. I rejected the thought of shouting a warning that would simply turn a robbery into a hostage situation immediately. I braced myself, years of training channeling the adrenaline into sharp, focused readiness. My gaze locked onto the suspect nearest the bar, watching for the telltale movement that would signal the start of the attack. Every second stretched into an eternity, the sound of crystal clinking and joyous laughter grating against the silent scream of impending disaster. The attack began with a calculated, swift disruption. The lights flickering briefly was the intentional signal, a momentary blackout designed to cause confusion and draw the eyes of the guests toward the ceiling, away from the suspects. It lasted only 2 seconds, but that was all the time the perpetrators needed. When the light snapped back on, I saw the first man, the one near the bar, reach inside his ill-fitting waistcoat, his hand emerging holding a suppressed automatic pistol. Instinct took over. Before he could raise the weapon, I surged forward, shouting the one word that would cut through the noise of the celebration: gun. The word ripped through the happy murmurs like tearing silk. I didn't waste time on heroic posturing. My immediate objective was damage mitigation and protection. I threw myself towards the nearest group of startled guests, a family cluster that included an elderly woman and 2 children, tackling them behind a massive, marble-topped serving station, overturning the table as I went, creating a makeshift barricade. The armed man, startled by my immediate reaction, fired a shot not at me, but into the air, the loud, sharp crack echoing painfully despite the suppressor, instantly transforming the joyous reception into a scene of sheer terror. "Nobody move," the leader's voice boomed, amplified by the sudden, stunned silence of the crowd. "This is a robbery. Cooperate and nobody gets hurt." Chaos erupted, delayed by the initial shock. Screams followed. Guests dove behind furniture, or froze in paralysis, champagne flutes falling and shattering on the stone floor. I quickly assessed the deployment. Yes, 7. The 4 I had worried about had been hiding in plain sight. 2 emerged from behind decorative screens, 2 more from the kitchen entrance, all brandishing weapons, mostly pistols, but one carrying what appeared to be a shorter, more powerful rifle. They moved with paramilitary precision, quickly securing the perimeter and beginning the collection of valuables. They were not amateurs. I counted at least 30 terrified guests trapped in the immediate vicinity. The resort security team, Jenkins and his men, were nowhere in sight, likely still clustered uselessly near the distant, wrong east dock. We were alone. From my vantage point behind the overturned table, my eyes darted to my father. He and Eleanor were huddled near the main archway, their faces pale with shock and fear, their wealth now a liability. One of the robbers, a stocky man with a severe crew cut, was already upon them, demanding Richard's expensive watch and Eleanor's massive diamond necklace. Richard, the man who commanded boardrooms and terrified junior partners, looked utterly helpless, his lifetime of financial power melting away under the threat of a 9mm barrel. The confrontation escalated rapidly. The crew-cut robber barked at Richard, demanding the safe code for the bridal suite, clearly seeking the bulk of the wedding gifts and valuables. "Now," he snarled, pressing the cold steel of the gun barrel against Richard's temple. "I don't know it by heart," Richard stammered, his voice thin and unrecognizable. "It's written on a card in the main desk ledger." The crew-cut man raised his weapon higher, his index finger tightening on the trigger. In the midst of this terrifying tableau, the elderly woman I had shielded began hyperventilating, her panic attack worsening rapidly, drawing the unwanted attention of a nearby robber. "Shut her up," the supervisor of the team yelled, his attention momentarily diverted from collecting assets to maintaining control. That was my opening, a tiny, precious sliver of opportunity. My professional training dictated the approach least likely to cause a mass casualty event, controlled intervention using psychological dominance and tactical precision. I rose slowly, hands clearly visible, speaking with the utmost calm, my voice cutting through the panic but remaining authoritative. "I'm a medic," I announced, projecting confidence. "Let me help her before she has a full cardiac event." "You don't want a death on your hands, that's the difference between robbery and murder charges." The robber hesitated, the sudden injection of technical, legal reality pausing his momentum. He needed control, not complexity. He jerked his gun toward the distressed woman. "Make it quick." My focus remained hyper-alert. I moved deliberately, hands open, kneeling beside the woman while my peripheral vision conducted a rapid, dynamic threat assessment, the positions of all 7 men, the nearest escape routes, and the location of Richard. As I pretended to check the woman's pulse and coached her breathing, I spotted a flicker of movement through the French doors leading to the exterior gardens, uniformed local police, finally arriving, moving stealthily through the hedges, still unnoticed by the robbers. It was time to initiate the final phase, the planned diversion, to give the arriving police time to deploy. The urgency had reached a fever pitch. The police were outside, deployed but still maneuvering. The robbers were escalating the pressure, focusing their attention on obtaining the safe code from Richard. My initial gambit, the medic ruse, had bought me perhaps 60 seconds, but the supervisor was growing impatient. He was standing directly over Richard, gun still pressed to his head, radiating intense, lethal intent. "No phones, no more stalling," the supervisor snapped, his voice dangerously low. "If you don't give me the code now, I start making examples." My father, Richard, who had dismissed my life as inconsequential, was staring down death, his terror naked and complete. Something fundamental shifted within me. It wasn't about seeking approval or reconciliation, it was the pure, visceral, ingrained duty of protection, the responsibility of the sheepdog to the flock, even the deeply flawed member of the flock who happened to be my father. I knew I couldn't allow him to be executed, regardless of our history. This was the moment of singularity, where personal resentment and professional duty collided. I had to draw the supervisor away from Richard and neutralize him before he could harm anyone, specifically my father. I rose from the elderly woman's side, my movement slow and deliberate, drawing all attention to myself. "There's a master list of codes at the front desk," I stated firmly, inventing the detail but lending it credibility with my authoritative tone. "I work here. I can get it for you. The front desk is clear right now, no witnesses." The supervisor, recognizing the potential for a quick, low-risk way to acquire the full haul, turned his predatory attention from Richard to me. His eyes narrowed, suspicious but avaricious. "You work here doing what?" "Security," I replied, meeting his gaze without flinching, standing up fully to maximize my physical presence. He took the bait, approaching me quickly, stepping away from Richard and toward the center of the floor, creating the crucial distance I needed. As he came within striking range, approximately 6 feet, he lowered his weapon slightly, his focus shifting entirely to my proposition, underestimating the woman who claimed the most basic security title. That single moment of arrogance was his fatal error. Years of high-intensity close-quarters combat training took over, a kinetic memory ingrained deep in my muscle tissue. It was a fluid, explosive sequence. I took 2 rapid steps inward, closing the distance instantly. My left hand shot out, not toward the gun, but toward his wrist, deflecting his weapon arm outward and away from the crowd. Simultaneously, my right shoulder drove into his chest, disrupting his balance and center of gravity. I used his momentum against him, twisting his body into a vertical axis while applying intense pressure to his captured wrist, executing a textbook disarm. The pistol clattered harmlessly onto the carpeted floor as he roared in pain and surprise. I maintained my grip, using his stunned, heavily built frame as a partial shield while I delivered the prearranged signal. "Now!" I shouted toward the hidden corners of the room. The reaction was immediate and synchronized. Michael Jenkins, along with 2 plainclothes officers who had blended in among the initial guests, a brilliant strategic move by the police captain, surged forward. Jenkins and his men, armed primarily with batons, focused on crowd control and securing the periphery, while the undercover officers engaged the remaining 6 robbers. Gunfire erupted briefly, sharp bursts of controlled response fire, instantly suppressing the shock and confusion of the remaining robbers. The situation devolved into a scramble. Seeing their leader captured and effectively neutralized, I had him in a tight elbow lock, pinning him to the floor, and facing organized resistance, several of the robbers threw down their weapons immediately. But one, the man with the crew cut who had threatened my father, panicked. He bolted toward the kitchen exit, grabbing a terrified server near the dessert table and placing his pistol against her head. "I'm taking her." "Back off," he screamed into the melee. I felt a searing, intense pain tear through my upper left arm, a sickening heat that told me one of the initial shots fired by the fleeing accomplice had found its mark. I barely registered it, the adrenaline overriding the shock. I secured the captured leader further with a zip tie I'd had discreetly stashed in my dress pocket, a professional habit, and then, despite the blood immediately blooming across my dress sleeve, I began my pursuit of the final, most dangerous suspect. The chase led me through the brightly lit, sterile environment of the resort's professional kitchen. The air was heavy with the smell of roasting meat and cleaning agents, a stark contrast to the gunfire and chaos I had just left. The fleeing robber, still holding the young server in a desperate headlock, was moving fast, stumbling slightly over kitchen mats, heading directly for the loading dock, the true final exit he intended to use. My wound, though painful, a searing, hot ache that throbbed rhythmically, was fortunately just a graze across the tricep muscle, meaning my motor skills remained largely intact, though compromised. I kept my distance, utilizing the massive stainless steel equipment and stacks of crates for cover, my voice ringing out clearly, authoritative and calm, honed by years of hostage negotiation training. "It's over," I called out, my voice echoing off the metallic surfaces. "Police have the building surrounded, the lead perpetrator is in custody, and all other avenues of escape are locked down. You have nowhere to go. Drop the weapon and release the hostage now." He paused near the massive industrial dishwasher, his breathing ragged, the hostage whimpering softly. He pressed the gun tighter to her temple, his eyes wild with cornered desperation. "Back off or I'll shoot her." "You're making this worse," I said, maintaining my tone, refusing to escalate the tension, using the same measured pace I had used to talk down far more volatile subjects in military zones. "The others surrendered, they will get better terms. If you shoot her, it's a capital charge. You don't want that on your conscience." I advanced slowly, carefully monitoring his minute movements for any shift in stance that signaled an immediate action. I noticed his grip on the hostage was slightly too high on her neck, compromising his balance, and his weapon arm was stretched out and unsupported. That tiny vulnerability was all I needed. As I took one final, deliberate step forward, pretending to reach into my dress pocket for a non-existent communication device, he momentarily hesitated, momentarily distracted by my movement. In that instant, I lunged, closing the critical distance faster than he could react. My left hand, ignoring the searing pain from the graze, slammed into his weapon arm just above the wrist, forcing the muzzle up and away from the server's head. Simultaneously, I delivered a precise, open palm strike, a pressure point application, to his radial nerve near the elbow. The shock caused his grip to loosen on the hostage, who tumbled away, scrambling to safety behind a large utility cart. The gun clattered against the tile floor. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I pivoted into him, securing him in a restraint hold, a standard military technique that uses the subject's own weight and leverage to immobilize them without unnecessary force. He struggled briefly, a pathetic, grunting sound, before realizing the fight was over. I held him there until Jenkins, who had followed cautiously after hearing the struggle, arrived with 2 uniformed officers to secure the final suspect. Returning to the main hall felt like entering a different dimension. The scene was secure, but scattered with the remnants of chaos, overturned tables, broken glass, abandoned champagne flutes. The police had 5 of the 7 suspects in cuffs, lined up against a wall. The remaining 2 were secured off-site. My father and Eleanor stood together, being interviewed by a detective, both looking absolutely shell-shocked. Richard saw me immediately. His eyes, tracking the movement of my approach, locked onto the dark, spreading stain of blood on the sleeve of my expensive evening gown. All the previous arrogance and condescension drained instantly from his face, replaced by a profound, raw shock. "Samantha," he whispered, his voice catching, "you're hurt." "It's just a graze," I replied, the adrenaline beginning to crash, making the pain in my arm suddenly intense and demanding. "It's superficial." Before he could answer, a paramedic, already on scene tending to minor guest injuries, spotted the blood and firmly intercepted me. As they led me toward a triage area near the entrance, I heard a murmuring among the guests who were now emerging from hiding. One distinguished-looking gentleman leaned toward his wife, his voice ringing with disbelief. "That's Richard's daughter." "Did you see what she did?" "The security guard? She took down their leader." The label still clung, but now, the context had violently, unequivocally changed. The sound of my father's name, linked to the daughter he had tried to hide, was suddenly echoing with admiration, not shame. It was a bizarre, profoundly validating sound. The next hour was a disorienting blend of clinical efficiency and high-stakes police procedural. The paramedics cleaned and dressed the bullet graze, confirming it was indeed superficial, requiring only stitches and a heavy bandage. The police captain, a stern, serious woman named Captain Reyes, personally took my statement. She reviewed the resort's security camera footage, which had miraculously remained operational, confirming every detail of the sequence, especially the moment I had drawn the leader away from my father and executed the disarm. "Miss Williams," Captain Reyes said, closing her notebook, her eyes holding genuine respect. If you hadn't identified the threat early and acted when you did, this would have been a massacre. These men are part of a crew that operates with extreme prejudice. They don't usually leave witnesses, especially if they are looking at serious time. You saved lives today. Possibly dozens. Her words were the highest professional validation I could receive, far outweighing any praise from my father's peers. Finally, the commotion began to subside, the police securing the evidence and transferring the suspects. My father approached the triage area, standing awkwardly beside the curtain as the paramedic finished applying the final thick dressing to my arm. The color had returned to his face, but the bravado was gone, replaced by a fragility I had never witnessed. "The police captain," he started, his voice thick, "she told me you saved lives today. Including, possibly mine. And Eleanor's." He didn't know how to bridge the immense gap that separated us. The years of dismissal, the casual cruelty of his introductions, were suddenly insurmountable, rendered absurd by the fact that the disappointment had just risked her life for him. "I was just doing my job, Dad," I said quietly, deliberately throwing his words back at him, the sting of the repetition necessary. "Even if it's just being a security guard." His face flushed, a deep, painful red. He opened his mouth, searching for words, but the enormity of his past failures seemed to choke him. He simply nodded, unable to speak, the shame and the dawning realization of my true competence battling across his features. I gave my final statement and was released. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, but there was a quiet, deep satisfaction in knowing that my choices, my career, had just proved their worth in the most undeniable, absolute way possible. I returned to my room, skipping the immediate cleanup phase and collapsing into bed. The next morning, I woke to my phone relentlessly buzzing. My boss at Meridian, Mr. Chen, had called 4 times. His messages were ecstatic. "Samantha, the firm is incredibly proud. This is unprecedented exposure. We've already had 3 calls from major clients referencing the incident." I reached for the remote and turned on the television. My professional headshot, the one I used on the Meridian website, where I looked serious and competent in my tactical gear, was plastered across the screen. The headline scrolling beneath the image read, "Attempted armed robbery at luxury resort wedding foiled by security expert." The news anchor detailed the chaos and my decisive intervention, praising my courageous action and strategic thinking. Guests interviewed provided increasingly heroic, slightly exaggerated accounts of my actions. Then, Captain Reyes appeared, reiterating her professional assessment, "The quick thinking and highly specialized actions of Miss Williams, a decorated military veteran and security professional, prevented what could have been a tragic outcome for dozens of high-profile individuals." My professional identity, the one Richard had systematically erased, was being broadcast across every major network, undeniable and magnificent, a testament to the path I had chosen, not the one he had imposed. The world was finally seeing Samantha Williams, the expert, not just Samantha Williams, the failure. I knew I couldn't avoid the post-wedding brunch, duty required one final appearance. I slipped into a simple, high-neck dress that concealed the thick bandage on my arm and walked into a room where the atmosphere had shifted entirely, transformed from cool dismissal to rapt curiosity. I was no longer peripheral, I was the center of attention, the unexpected star of Richard Williams' wedding weekend, a development I knew he couldn't possibly handle with grace, yet one I was ready to face head-on. The stage was set for the final, necessary confrontation of our relationship. The stakes had moved from survival to ultimate recognition, a battle I had already won, but one he still needed to lose gracefully.